December 7, 1941, began like any other Sunday morning for most Americans, but by the time the sun set over the Pacific, the world had changed forever. Reports crackled across the radio, a voice trembling yet urgent: Pearl Harbor had been attacked. Hundreds of planes, thousands of soldiers, ships burning and sinking. The attack was swift, devastating, and shocking, and it plunged a nation that had clung to isolation into the chaos of global war. Across America, families huddled around radios, eyes wide, hands gripping each other, hearts pounding with disbelief. Fear mixed with anger, and somewhere in that swirl of emotions, the seeds of a new kind of battle were sown not on land or sea, but in the minds of millions. Before the guns even cooled, the U.S. government understood that victory in this war would require more than weapons and soldiers. It would require the unity, commitment, and imagination of an entire population. The Office of War Information was born in 1942 to take on this enormous task, tasked with shaping the narrative of the conflict and ensuring that Americans understood not just what they were fighting against, but what they were fighting for. Newspapers, radio, films, posters, advertisements all became tools in this immense psychological machinery. Every medium carried a carefully crafted message, a reminder that every American was part of the fight, whether on a battlefield or in a factory, kitchen, or classroom. Almost immediately, the imagery of war began to appear everywhere. Posters plastered across cities and towns demanded attention with bold slogans: "Buy war bonds, loose lips might sink ships, we can do it." The women portrayed on these posters were no longer just housewives, they were Rosie the Riveter, powerful and determined, hammering away in factories to produce the planes, tanks, and munitions that soldiers needed to survive. Men saw these posters and knew that working overtime at the steel mill, keeping rationing, and contributing in small ways was a moral obligation, a silent battlefield where every action mattered. Even children were drawn into the narrative, collecting scrap metal and rolling bandages for hospitals, believing themselves heroes in a story that extended far beyond the boundaries of their own neighborhoods. Radio became the lifeblood of wartime America, delivering news, speeches, music, and stories directly into living rooms across the nation. Families gathered to hear President Roosevelt's calm, reassuring voice, his words carefully chosen to instill confidence and resolve. Headlines were read aloud, punctuated with urgent music and commentary, making distant battles feel immediate, making victory and sacrifice personal. The airwaves carried not just information but emotion, shaping moods and opinions, ensuring that every listener understood that the war demanded more than attention. It demanded commitment, courage, and, above all, belief. Hollywood, the dream factory of America, also stepped into the fray with unprecedented zeal. Filmmakers understood that cinema was no longer just entertainment, it was a weapon, a way to mold hearts and minds. Government offices collaborated with studios to produce films that elevated the everyday American to heroic status. Soldiers, nurses, factory workers, and mothers became protagonists in epic stories of resilience and duty. Documentaries like Frank Capra's Why We Fight series transformed complex geopolitics into a clear narrative of good versus evil, freedom versus tyranny, democracy versus oppression. Even in comedy and musicals, subtle messages reinforced the themes of loyalty, sacrifice, and the righteousness of the national cause. Audiences left theaters inspired, their fears soothed, their anger focused, their determination sharpened. Propaganda wasn't always subtle. Newspapers and magazines carried images and stories that dehumanized the enemy, particularly the Japanese and Germans, portraying them as monstrous, deceitful, and ruthless. This portrayal created a clear emotional target for anger and fear, making the public ready to support the extraordinary sacrifices demanded by total war. At the same time, the moral framework of the propaganda positioned Americans as defenders of freedom, liberty, and decency. Every soldier in uniform, every woman in a factory, every citizen rationing or buying bonds, became a symbol of this struggle, their actions imbued with meaning far beyond themselves. The line between ordinary life and wartime heroism blurred, and propaganda made that blur both believable and noble. Advertising, too, was enlisted in this silent battle. Products became more than products, they became patriotic statements. Soap, sugar, shoes, tires, and even cigarettes carried messages that connected consumer behavior to the war effort. Buy less, save more, recycle, grow your own vegetables, write letters to soldiers. Every act, however small, was framed as a contribution to the national cause. Comic books featured Superman, Captain America, and other heroes punching Nazis and Axis leaders, turning entertainment into moral education. Even fashion became a stage for patriotism. Red, white, and blue accents, victory pins, and practical clothing for working women conveyed participation in the larger struggle. By the end of 1942, it was clear that propaganda was doing more than persuading, it was shaping belief. Americans had internalized the idea that they were active participants in a global fight, not just passive observers. Fear and anxiety were tempered with pride and purpose. The idea that each individual, from the youngest child to the oldest factory worker, could influence the outcome of battles halfway around the world, became central to the national consciousness. Victory, it seemed, depended as much on hearts and minds as on tanks and planes. The genius of this effort was in its subtlety. Americans didn't feel forced or coerced, they felt inspired. They bought bonds, grew gardens, rationed, and worked longer hours because they believed in the story they were told, a story that connected them intimately to distant oceans, foreign skies, and endless jungles where their brothers in uniform fought and died. Every poster, every film reel, every radio broadcast reinforced the message: the nation was at war, and everyone mattered. Each small act of participation became proof of loyalty and courage, a measure of personal honor intertwined with the destiny of a country fighting for its survival. By the time the first year of war had passed, the machinery of propaganda had become nearly invisible. Its power lay not in coercion but in shaping identity, belief, and daily action. Ordinary Americans had been transformed into a society united by a shared narrative, a collective mission, and a profound sense of purpose. And while bombs fell in distant lands, the battles on the home front, every slogan, every image, every message were proving just as decisive. The war for hearts and minds was being won in living rooms, factories, theaters, and schools across the country. Pearl Harbor had been the spark, but it was the invisible, persistent power of propaganda that turned shock into action, fear into resolve, and a divided nation into a united one. The home front mobilization cinematic version. The whistle of factory machines cut through the early morning air like artillery fire, blending with the rhythmic hammering of metal and the roar of engines. Detroit, Pittsburgh, and every industrial city in between had become battlefields, though no bullets flew here, only sweat, steel, and determination. Women in overalls, hair tucked under kerchiefs, carried heavy plates of machinery parts across factory floors. Men, once clerks or shopkeepers, now operated presses and drills, learning quickly that their work was as essential to victory as any soldier's courage. Outside the factories, children ran errands for victory gardens, collecting scrap metal, paper, and rubber, turning their small contributions into symbols of patriotism. Every street corner, every kitchen table, every schoolroom seemed touched by the war, and Americans were learning that supporting the fight at home was a full-time job. The government understood that the success of this home front mobilization depended on communication, on ensuring every citizen knew their role. Posters plastered across every wall, billboard, and street lamp shouted the message, "Your country needs you, every worker a soldier, do your part." These weren't suggestions, they were imperatives, and the nation responded. Rosie the Riveter, the iconic figure of muscular determination and patriotic grit, became the symbol of women in industry. Each image wasn't just encouragement, it was a blueprint, showing women how to lift, carry, weld, and drill while smiling, confident that they were shaping history. Men, meanwhile, saw in those posters both accountability and honor. Work hard, keep production going, and you were fighting alongside the troops overseas. Even in everyday life, propaganda became omnipresent. Radio announcers reminded listeners to buy war bonds, conserve materials, and participate in rationing programs. Advertisements transformed products into patriotic acts: save fuel, save rubber, save freedom. One commercial urged, linking household decisions to the outcome of battles thousands of miles away. Newspapers printed stories of factories that exceeded quotas, of towns where scrap drives collected tons of metal, and of children who planted hundreds of victory gardens. These stories were not just information, they were narratives of heroism that framed ordinary citizens as soldiers in a new, domestic war. The nation, once a patchwork of individual concerns, now beat as one, driven by the certainty that every action mattered. Comic books and magazines targeted younger audiences with the same urgency. Superman punched out Nazis, Captain America leapt from page to page, taking down enemies with righteous force. It was thrilling, of course, but also instructive. Even imaginary heroes fought for justice, and ordinary children could do the same by helping with scrap drives or learning to write letters to soldiers abroad. Every story, every panel, reinforced the idea that the war was everywhere, that even playtime could be patriotic, and that the line between fiction and national duty was thinner than anyone realized. Radio dramas brought the war into living rooms in a different way, combining suspense and storytelling with subtle lessons in civic responsibility. Families gathered around the crackling speaker as announcers described battles in vivid detail, emphasizing heroism, courage, and the importance of unity. Music carried morale as well. Upbeat songs reminded soldiers and civilians alike that their sacrifices were meaningful, creating a sense of shared identity that cut across states, classes, and generations. The war, once distant, became intimately personal, shaping how people dressed, spoke, and thought. Hollywood's influence on the home front grew stronger with each passing year. Films like Mrs. Miniver showed families enduring hardship with dignity, reminding audiences that domestic perseverance was heroic. Even musicals and comedies, designed to entertain, carried undercurrents of moral instruction. Loyalty, sacrifice, and resilience became as important as laughter or dance. The government's Office of War Information worked closely with studios, reviewing scripts and suggesting adjustments to ensure that every film reinforced the national message. A night at the movies was no longer just leisure, it was training, inspiration, and subtle conditioning. Yet propaganda on the home front was not limited to positive reinforcement. Fear, guilt, and anger were powerful tools, and the media wielded them skillfully. Stories of enemy atrocities, exaggerated or selective, created moral outrage, while illustrations and caricatures of Axis leaders framed them as fundamentally evil, dangerous, and dehumanized. These narratives strengthened resolve and justified sacrifice, ensuring that Americans understood that every ration, every extra hour at work, and every bond purchased was part of a righteous fight. Children and adults alike absorbed these lessons, often without realizing it, reinforcing the culture of total participation. Even shopping became political. Ration books were handled with the same care as a soldier's orders, and every act of saving or conserving was transformed into a moral victory. Housewives learned to bake without sugar, cook creatively with limited meat, and stretch every ingredient. Schools incorporated scrap drives and patriotic lessons into curricula, and playgrounds became venues for planting seeds that would grow into victory gardens. Propaganda had seeped into the very fabric of society, turning ordinary life into a constant reminder of duty, patriotism, and collective identity. By the end of 1942, the home front had been transformed. Factories ran 24 hours a day, streets were lined with posters, radios crackled with urgent news and stirring music, and cinema screens illuminated images of heroism and sacrifice. Americans, young and old, understood that the war effort was not just the responsibility of soldiers, it was a national project, requiring every hand, every mind, and every ounce of energy. The propaganda machine had achieved what no single military campaign could: it had made an entire country believe in the power and necessity of its own action. What made this transformation remarkable was its subtlety. Americans were not coerced, they were inspired. They felt ownership of the war effort, pride in their small acts, and responsibility for the larger outcome. Each contribution, whether folding parachutes, writing letters, planting a garden, or buying a war bond, was a piece of the larger narrative. In doing so, they became part of a collective story, a story in which the outcome of distant battles depended as much on their choices at home as on the valor of soldiers abroad. The line between civilian and warrior blurred, and the war was waged in hearts, minds, and homes as decisively as it was on beaches, jungles, and skies. By mid-1943, Americans had internalized the rhythm of wartime life. The nation's identity had been reshaped by media, messaging, and culture, leaving no corner untouched by the demands of total war. The home front, once a backdrop to battles abroad, had become a stage of equal importance, where every citizen played a role. Factories, kitchens, classrooms, and streets were now arenas of action, and propaganda had turned ordinary life into extraordinary effort, binding the country together in purpose, resolve, and belief. Victory would be measured not only by the fall of enemy cities but by the unity, courage, and sacrifice of a nation mobilized, transformed, and inspired by the relentless power of its own media. The theater lights dimmed, and the hush of the crowd was broken only by the scratchy hum of the newsreel projector. Families leaned forward, children clutched candy wrappers, and soldiers on leave sat shoulder to shoulder with civilians. On the screen, images of battlefields, smoke rising from bombed cities, and marching troops flickered in stark black and white, accompanied by urgent narration: "Our boys are fighting for freedom. We must do our part." The war, once distant and abstract, was suddenly real, immediate, and personal. In that darkened theater, thousands of Americans absorbed not just the stories of battles overseas but the emotional instruction that came with them. Hollywood had become a front line in the battle for hearts and minds. Filmmakers understood the stakes. Movies were no longer mere entertainment, they were weapons in a psychological campaign to inspire, instruct, and unify. Dramatic films like Mrs. Miniver and Casablanca illustrated the courage of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Families huddled together on the screen, enduring bombings, heartbreak, and the constant threat of loss, yet finding ways to persevere. Through these narratives, audiences saw that heroism was not limited to soldiers with rifles. The mother maintaining her household, the clerk keeping the economy running, the nurse saving lives, all were heroes in the cinematic vision of a nation at war. By blending fiction with moral instruction, these films created a shared understanding of duty, sacrifice, and righteousness. Newsreels preceding feature films brought the realities of battle into local cinemas. Explosions, advancing troops, and sinking ships were presented with dramatic narration, shaping public perception of the enemy and the urgency of victory. For many Americans, the newsreel was the only window into the conflict, and it was carefully designed to evoke pride, fear, and determination. Every scene emphasized the stakes: freedom versus tyranny, democracy versus oppression. The audience left the theater not merely entertained but motivated, their emotions aligned with national objectives, their commitment reinforced by the powerful combination of visual storytelling and patriotic messaging. Cartoons played a subtle yet potent role in this war of influence. Characters like Bugs Bunny, Popeye, and Superman became not only sources of laughter but also instructors in morality and patriotism. Axis leaders were caricatured as buffoons or monsters, ensuring that children internalized the narrative of good versus evil from a young age. Superheroes literally punched out enemies on the page and screen, symbolizing justice and righteousness. These stories were simple enough for children to understand, yet powerful enough to create lasting impressions about duty, loyalty, and national pride. The boundaries between play, imagination, and propaganda blurred seamlessly. Music, too, carried messages that reinforced the emotional landscape of war. Patriotic songs, broadcast over the radio and performed in theaters, uplifted spirits and strengthened resolve. Lyrics celebrated courage, sacrifice, and unity, while marching rhythms and upbeat tunes created a sense of purpose and collective energy. Soldiers abroad, hearing the same music, felt a connection to families at home, while civilians listening on their radios shared a bond with distant battlefields. Every note, every refrain, became part of the symphony of national effort, intertwining personal emotions with a larger narrative of duty. Propaganda also exploited fear and anger to shape public sentiment. Films and cartoons often exaggerated enemy atrocities, creating moral outrage that justified extraordinary sacrifices. Japanese and German leaders were depicted as cunning, cruel, and inhuman, ensuring that public support for harsh military measures remained strong. The emotional framing of the enemy was as much a weapon as any gun, creating a mental battlefield where citizens were prepared to endure rationing, long work hours, and personal loss. Americans internalized the idea that every hardship was part of a larger struggle against a clearly defined evil, making personal sacrifices meaningful and morally imperative. Advertising and print media continued to reinforce these lessons. Movie magazines, newspaper columns, and promotional materials highlighted the bravery of characters on screen, connecting fictional heroism to real-world duty. Fashion, home decor, and even recipes were subtly shaped by patriotic messaging, ensuring that the aesthetics of daily life reflected wartime priorities. Housewives, workers, and students absorbed these cues, often unconsciously, as the culture around them transformed into a continuous lesson in loyalty, resilience, and participation. Entertainment became inseparable from ideology, every narrative a strand in a vast network of social instruction. By 1943, the effects of entertainment propaganda were evident in public morale. Americans, constantly exposed to heroic narratives, felt connected to the war effort in profound ways. Soldiers' bravery was celebrated not only on the battlefield but in living rooms, theaters, and classrooms across the nation. Civilians understood that they, too, were part of the fight, that reading about courage, watching heroism unfold on screen, or laughing at a cartoon villain was not passive but participatory. Propaganda had succeeded in transforming emotion into action, awareness into commitment, and leisure into a tool for shaping national consciousness. The subtle genius of Hollywood's contribution lay in its ability to blend emotional resonance with moral instruction. War was frightening, dangerous, and exhausting, yet films and media transformed fear into motivation. Ordinary Americans were not lectured but inspired. They were shown the value of perseverance, the meaning of sacrifice, and the necessity of unity. By making these lessons entertaining, relatable, and emotionally powerful, the media ensured that the culture of total war permeated every corner of daily life. The lessons were absorbed seamlessly, as much through emotion as logic, embedding a collective sense of purpose that transcended individual experience. Even after leaving the theater, the impact lingered. Children acted out heroic deeds, women returned to factories with renewed determination, and men double-checked their contributions to the war effort. Conversations in homes, schools, and workplaces echoed the narrative seen on screen. The cinematic lens had not merely reflected the war, it had shaped the nation's understanding of itself, its enemies, and its role in the global struggle. Americans were convinced that they were part of something larger than themselves, that every choice, every effort, every small act of courage contributed to victory. In this way, Hollywood and entertainment media became as critical a battlefield as Normandy or Guadalcanal, influencing millions in ways that no bullet or bomb ever could. By the close of 1943, it was clear that entertainment had become a weapon of immense power. The combination of films, newsreels, cartoons, music, and print media had created a continuous, immersive experience that instructed, motivated, and shaped public sentiment. Americans believed in the cause not only because of patriotic appeals but because they had lived it emotionally through the stories, images, and sounds that filled their homes and theaters. The war was no longer distant, it was lived, felt, and understood on a personal level. And in that understanding, the media had achieved what few conventional weapons could: it had made the nation itself an instrument of victory. The first crackle of the radio at dawn brought the familiar sense of urgency, a voice proclaiming victory or loss, hope or warning, echoing across cities, towns, and farms. By 1945, Americans had lived under the constant hum of war for nearly 4 years. They had endured rationing, sent sons and daughters to distant fronts, worked endless hours in factories, and absorbed a relentless stream of images, stories, and songs. Every billboard, newsreel, poster, and radio broadcast had shaped their daily lives, creating a generation for whom the war was not only a distant event but an intimate, lived reality. The machinery of propaganda had achieved something remarkable: it had turned a nation into participants in a global struggle, emotionally invested in every battle, every victory, every loss. Even after the guns fell silent, the messages endured. Newspapers recounted heroic deeds, memorialized fallen soldiers, and celebrated victories abroad. Magazines ran stories about rebuilding Europe, honoring veterans, and recognizing the contributions of factory workers and nurses. Citizens, conditioned for years to see themselves as actors in a larger narrative, carried forward a sense of collective purpose. Propaganda, once a tool of persuasion, had become part of the national memory, shaping how Americans understood their own history, their values, and their role in the world. The war had ended, but the lessons and the influence of media remained embedded in the culture. The most striking aspect of this legacy was its subtlety. Propaganda had never simply demanded obedience, it had inspired belief. Through carefully crafted films, posters, music, and radio programs, Americans had internalized the idea that every action mattered, from working overtime in a factory to planting a garden to buying war bonds. The nation had been mobilized not just physically but psychologically, and the effects were lasting. Civic responsibility, personal sacrifice, and national pride became deeply intertwined, forming a framework that would guide American society long after the final bombs had fallen. Hollywood's contributions continued to resonate. Films made during the war, both documentaries and fictional stories, became historical records, shaping public memory and providing a sense of continuity between the battlefield and the home front. The narrative of ordinary citizens rising to extraordinary challenges created a blueprint for understanding civic duty, heroism, and resilience. The emotional lessons absorbed in darkened theaters and over radio speakers helped cement a national identity built on participation, unity, and shared purpose. Even as the world rebuilt, Americans remembered that their victories were collective, their sacrifices meaningful, and their contributions essential. Radio, too, left a profound legacy. Families who had gathered around the crackling speakers for updates, entertainment, and moral instruction had been shaped by years of consistent messaging. News broadcasts, music, and speeches had not only informed but emotionally conditioned listeners, creating a society that was aware of its interconnectedness and responsibilities. The rhythm of wartime life, reports of victories, calls for continued effort, stories of heroism had created a shared national experience. This experience extended beyond the war, influencing civic engagement, community organization, and public awareness in peacetime. Americans had learned that communication was more than information, it was influence, and influence could mobilize an entire society. The images of heroism, sacrifice, and duty lingered in public consciousness, shaping values and social norms. Posters and films depicting strong women in factories, children contributing to the war effort, and families enduring hardship had normalized participation and collective effort. Gender roles expanded, civic responsibility deepened, and patriotism became an everyday practice. Even in peacetime, these cultural shifts endured, influencing workplace dynamics, educational priorities, and social expectations. The war had been a crucible, and the lessons embedded in media and propaganda had reshaped American life permanently. At the same time, the moral framing of enemies and allies left lasting impressions. Caricatures of Axis leaders, depictions of enemy cruelty, and stories of battles won against overwhelming odds had created a clear narrative of good and evil. These narratives shaped post-war perceptions of international politics, alliances, and responsibility. Americans had come to understand the world through the lens provided by wartime media, internalizing the values of democracy, freedom, and collective defense. Propaganda had done more than sell bonds or boost factory output, it had educated a nation in ideology and perspective, creating a population prepared to support both military and moral leadership on the global stage. Education, too, absorbed the lessons of wartime propaganda. Schools incorporated history lessons that emphasized heroism and sacrifice, community projects that mirrored scrap drives and victory gardens, and moral instruction grounded in the narratives disseminated through film, radio, and print. Children grew up believing in the power of their individual actions, seeing themselves as participants in society rather than passive observers. The emphasis on civic duty, collective responsibility, and ethical engagement became part of the fabric of American identity, influencing generations long after the war's end. Propaganda had seamlessly integrated itself into learning, transforming pedagogy into a tool for shaping character as well as knowledge. Even daily habits reflected the imprint of wartime messaging. Rationing, recycling, and conservation had taught Americans the importance of foresight, community responsibility, and the long-term impact of individual choices. These behaviors, once driven by necessity and propaganda, became cultural norms, influencing post-war practices and expectations. media, storytelling, and visual messaging had successfully instilled a sense of purpose and discipline, demonstrating the lasting power of coordinated communication. Citizens had been trained not just to survive war but to thrive in its aftermath, guided by principles learned through years of narrative shaping. By 1946, the nation had returned to peacetime, yet the echoes of wartime propaganda remained. Americans had been mobilized mentally, emotionally, and socially, and that mobilization did not dissipate with the signing of peace treaties. The shared experience of collective action, shaped by films, posters, radio, and print, had forged a sense of unity and purpose that transcended the immediate conflict. Society had been transformed, not just by military victories, but by the pervasive, subtle, and relentless influence of media. The home front had been a battlefield, and its lessons discipline, sacrifice, heroism, and participation had become part of the American psyche. Ultimately, the legacy of wartime propaganda was more than national pride, it was a blueprint for influence, a demonstration of how media could shape perception, action, and identity. The lessons of World War II informed Cold War strategies, civic engagement programs, and cultural narratives for decades to come. Americans learned that stories, images, and music were not mere entertainment, they were instruments of unity, instruction, and motivation. The war was over, but the lessons endured. The mind, as much as the body, was a battlefield, and those who controlled narratives could shape history itself.